Hi there, and welcome to the Rethinking the Human Factor podcast with me, your host, Bruce Hallis. Now, for those of you who have been long-time listeners, this show is well and truly overdue. I think we are coming up to almost a year since the end of Series 3. So first things first, let me apologize to you. Obviously, there's been quite a lot that's been happening over the last sort of 9 months, but it's great to actually finally be back. So what have we been doing during this sort of period of absence from your podcast stream? Well, first, we've been planning Series 4, which is really important to us to make sure that we sort of go into identifying our guests with a plan in mind. And that plan is about tackling specific issues. And what we wanted to do was to, one, build on the sort of topics that we've introduced in the previous 3 series. The other thing we wanted to do was to try and get a regulatory discussion going. The third thing we wanted to do was to look at the human factor as part of an actual incident. So instead of thinking about the human factor in that sort of as a part of your prevention strategy, preventing non-compliance with policy, how does this all stack up in the middle of an apocalyptic security incident? Because in my experience, what makes people great at planning doesn't necessarily make them brilliant all the time when it comes to putting that into action in the heat of the moment. So I wanted to get somebody else's view upon that. So yeah, Series 4 of the show, I think, is going to prove to be another step forward in terms of thinking about rethinking the human factor, which is what the show is all about. The second thing that I did during this period of downtime was to think about how I helped CISOs, data protection officers, security and data protection professionals who are responsible for, raising awareness and influencing behaviour and embedding security data protection into an organisational culture, to take what I've been doing now in terms of training and coaching over the last 4 years, going back to 2017, that's right, yeah, and think about how can I bring that all online. Obviously, there's a practical reason for doing that, but also it's actually reflecting what a lot of people have been asking me about in the last year or two. Anyway, so I've been very, very much focused upon redeveloping the training and coaching program, taking it from face-to-face and doing it actually online. Okay, so those of you who are new to the show, what is the show all about? Well, the show is really about raising awareness, influence behaviour, fostering an organisational culture where security and data protection are valued. What we do is we go out and we find guests to bring on the show that can provide us with insight into, one, their academic research around awareness, behaviour and culture, or disciplines that relate to the human aspects of awareness, behaviour and culture, or practitioners who are then putting that stuff into practice, or people actually combine both, academic study and research and practitioners. And a lot of those people come from outside of the security and data protection industry, and there's a really good reason why, because the challenge of awareness, behaviour and culture is not unique to information security and data protection. And so we're really focused upon how can we leverage what everybody else knows to better drive how we try and address that within the industry. And so the idea is that the guests come on the show, they share with you amazing insights, and that should give you sort of gold nuggets to take away, to sit back for 5 minutes, if you're allowed 5 minutes piece, and to use those to rethink how you're tackling those challenges within your own organization. So without further ado, let's get on with the first interview. Hi there, and welcome to this, the Rethinking the Human Factor podcast with me, your host, Bruce Hallis. Now, in Series 4, I did promise that I would be really looking to broaden the scope of the guests that we were actually bringing onto the show, and to try and engage more with the regulatory stakeholders who have their own challenges around awareness, behaviour and culture, but are also at the same time helping to try and enforce the regulatory demands around the human factor, education and awareness around, for example, data protection. And we've got a gentleman on the show who, if you've been around in the industry for the same sort of time that I have, his name will ring a very loud bell. And he's joined us on the show. I'm absolutely chuffed that he's been able to join us on the show. His name is Richard Thomas. And Richard needs no introduction to a lot of people, but to maybe some of you, he will need an introduction. So I'm going to ask him to introduce himself. So hi, Richard. Thank you very much for joining us on the show.
Well, hello, Bruce. Yes, Richard Thomas here. Yes, I suppose I had a certain fame or notoriety as the UK Information Commissioner between 2002 and 2009. It seems like ancient history now, but I still reverberate around data protection and indeed freedom of information circles, because the Information Commissioner's Office, as you and your listeners will know, is responsible for regulating both data protection and freedom of information. Mm-hmm. So I did that job for 7 years. I've done various other things in the meantime. I won't go into great detail, but I've been a member of the Committee on Standards in Public Life, the ethics body for government in this country. Okay. I'm currently a member of ACOBA, which is the Advisory Committee on Business Appointments, which vets all the jobs that cabinet ministers and senior civil servants go on to when they leave office. And I also have the privilege to be the chairman of the Data Protection Authority for the Bailiwick of Guernsey in the Channel Islands. And
beautiful island.
Beautiful island, and that has its own data protection authority, and they wanted a new chair and a new board of directors a couple of years ago, so that's one of my current jobs. My third current job, which is some relevance to this, I'm an occasional advisor to a think tank based in Washington in the States, with offices in London and Brussels and Paris, and that's called the Centre for Information Policy Leadership. And that takes out a lot of sort of paperwork and thinking about the future of data protection. It's thinking down the track. So, for example, the think tank led the way on the what's called the accountability principle and also a more risk-based approach to data protection. But I think you mainly want to sort of explore my experience as the UK Commissioner. And I don't know how much everyone understands the role of the ICO. It's changed quite dramatically since my time. It's trebled in size. My friend Liz Denham is the current commissioner. She has some 700 or 800 staff now. I was lucky to get up to about 300.
Okay.
But we had a fair amount of responsibility in those days, and it's even larger these days. But essentially to make sure that organizations understood and complied with their responsibilities under the law. In those days, it was the 1998 Data Protection Act based on the European Directive on Data Protection. And we also had the new challenge of freedom of information, which obliges all public bodies in the UK to deal with requests for information about their activities and reveal documents. Had some very hairy times with that. Over 100,000 public bodies in the UK, going from the Prime Minister's office down to the smallest parish council. Yep. And that all went live during my time. So that was a very heavy responsibility. And we had some interesting times with that.
Yep. And they still continue.
Yes, well, I still have a few scars. I mean, I think we can claim some credit for the scandal over Members of Parliament expenses, which we required those to be revealed. Tony Blair said in his book that FOI was a big mistake because it forced him to reveal things like which guests he was paying for at Chequers, or rather we were paying for, the taxpayers were paying for. And of course, more serious matters like the minutes of cabinet when they decided to invade Iraq, some very serious battles over that, and a wide range of disclosure requests up and down the country on a very wide range of controversial matters.
So I think it would be true to say that you've been very much at the heart over the last couple of decades around, how the UK and how we developed our sort of almost like our national information strategy. And there are elements of that. It's an information economy, and that has to be regulated. And I guess that brings me on to a question. What is the actual role of the regulator? I mean, what is its purpose?
Well, as a regulator, you have to look to your primary source. I think you've got a legal background, Bruce, as I have too. And the Acts of Parliament and the regulations set out in formal terms your duties and your discretions. And you must do this, you must do that, you may do this, you may do that, you can do this, you can do that. I divided the function under three broad headings. One is a policeman. You are there to enforce the law and in some cases to make orders, to impose sanctions if people don't do as they're told. Mm-hmm. Number two is to be an educator, a leader, an organization which helps people understand their responsibilities and make sure they do it properly. Mm-hmm. And thirdly, you are an ombudsman. You are required to deal with complaints from members of the public and resolve those complaints within the powers available. Sometimes those functions were interlinked. For example, under freedom of information, which I mentioned, you get a complaint that someone has made a request to the Cabinet Office or made a request to a local NHS trust, right, and they've been refused the access to the information. Mm-hmm. So you investigate that, you spend 2-3 months, whatever, looking at both sides, and in accordance with the law, you decide to uphold or reject the complaint. Mm-hmm. If you uphold it, you're then moving into policeman mode, because you say to the Cabinet Office or you say to the NHS Trust, you must disclose this information. And you are in contempt of court and you are facing very serious consequences if you don't. Right. Of those various functions, I would say, particularly in the data protection area, because of the complexities, the uncertainties and the challenges of data protection, that the leadership role, the education role, was the most important. Right. And when I was commissioner, it's going back a while now, but I think the tradition carries on within the ICO, I attached very high priority to giving pragmatic, down-to-earth advice as to what people were supposed to do. If you look at the strategies which we adopted, every organization has a strategy, and our strategy said very clearly, I'm doing it from memory now, but it was something like, our role is to help organizations who want to get data protection right to the best of our ability, and then to be tough on those who don't want to get it right. So quite a clear distinction between those who are struggling to get it right, and those who, if you like, stuck up two fingers to the law and weren't complying. So that was underlying our sort of philosophical approach to how we did it. But I completely overhauled the ICO website. You know, I'm very proud of the reputation we had there for putting out tons and tons of very practical guidance. Mm-hmm. Many years ago, back in the 1980s, I wrote a thing called Plain English for Lawyers. And I was determined that we
a good book.
Well, it had 3 editions, so I was very proud of that. But I was very, very insisted that we use plain language, short sentences. And I'm very pleased that, you know, my successors, Christopher Graham and Liz Denham, have continued that approach. And I think worldwide now, the ICO has a great reputation for plain, down-to-earth speaking about what's required. And just to give one example, I slightly failed on this one. I tried to forbid the use of the phrase data subject. Right. That is what you find in the European and indeed the British law. And I said, well, that's meaningless. You know, we're talking about people, consumers, citizens, employees, children, men, women. Data subject, we did a survey and only 10% had any idea what data subject meant. 90% thought it was something you studied at university or college. So I can imagine. I said, no, we're going to get rid of all these long words. We're going to, you know, just try and give pragmatic, down-to-earth advice. And if you go on the ICO website now, and I'm very proud, the same is also true of the website for the Guernsey Data Protection Office, you'll find, you know, down-to-earth, plain language guidance. Do this, do this. It's not always straightforward. I mean, data protection can be complicated. It can be rather vague. It requires judgment, but we gave our best. And we had, you know, teams of people on the end of a telephone giving advice, particularly where people were struggling with particular requirements.
And where do you think that came from? Because, you know, for somebody that trained as a lawyer, I mean, it's not unusual for people to say, you know, the policy content that has been communicated to an audience, to all the employees. And because of if it's being driven by the need to comply, you always get with people the sense of we need to transfer the legalese down so that we know we can say, well, this is when we communicated this to the employees, it was the legal content which ties up with this policy, which ties up with this piece of legislation or regulatory requirements. So, you know, there is this sense of there is a challenge where people go, well, how do I turn it from legalese to something that people understand?
Well, in my background, I'm a lawyer. Yes, I was a solicitor. I worked over the years at both Freshfields and Clifford Chance in the city, big law firms. But also, my formative years, I've worked as the legal officer for a body called the National Consumer Council.
Oh, okay.
I was also the solicitor before that for the Citizens Advice Bureau Service. And I was head of the consumer regulatory function at the Office of Fair Trading. So I've got a fairly good background in consumer policy and citizen policy. And what's deep in my psyche is that ordinary people behave the way ordinary people behave. And they have the struggles, the challenges, the opportunities, the risks, which are not normally the same as those of politicians, civil servants, or lawyers, who tend to think very rationally and very sort of complicatedly. I'm a great believer in making life as simple as possible. So I shouted a lot over the years. I've actually drafted 2 Acts of Parliament, which are on the statute book still, and they are in plain language. I've written the subject on plain language, and I've always said that what is important, this comes back to data protection, to a certain extent, I'm being a bit rude now, but to a certain extent in continental European terms, what's important is what's written down. I've always rejected that. I said, what's important is how organizations behave in practice and how they relate to people. It is not actually data protection, it's people protection. And it's about protecting people and protecting society against the abuses, irresponsible use of data in various ways. We're not protecting the data, we're trying to protect people. And I think some of my European colleagues occasionally, too many lawyers around, tended to sort of think, well, if it looks good on paper, that's the end of the story. I could expand that. I mean, it's to do a little bit with sort of a civil law and a common law tradition. Right. The civil law tradition is you can only do something if you're authorized to do it. We try to promote virtue. The common law approach is you can do what you like unless the law says you can't. And we try to stamp out evil. So that's a little bit of a sort of cultural difference, if you like. I mean, I'm not a Brexiteer. I'm absolutely opposite of that. I think it's a tragedy we're leaving Europe. But sometimes what I call the Anglo-Saxon influence, the Irish, the Scandinavians, the British, did try to moderate some of the more sort of obscure thinking of our European friends.
And I think what's interesting there is you points out that even at the regulatory level there, the difference in culture and how, you can have the same titles, but how you approach the same challenge is different just from a cultural perspective. Now, we've done a couple of interviews with a gentleman by the name of Gert-Jan Hofstede, and I'm going to drop him an email after this and say, this should really get your interest because he's very well known when it comes to culture. And we talked very much about the differences in the early stages of Brexit around the European and the UK sort of views upon Brexit, etc. It's really fascinating. But anyway, I want to move on to something now. So correct me if I'm wrong here, that part of what your responsibility was, there's a piece of legislation, and as a regulator, your responsibility was to take that legislation and to try and embed that within organisations, but also within society. And you had these sort of 3 ways that you did that. There was the police role, which was there to, when the legislation was being broken, your role was to enforce that. So I'm just going to pull out here. You would enforce it, but you weren't running a court, were you? How does that work? You might...
Okay, I'll take you through a bit more detail, the policeman role. The Information Commissioner's office is based outside Manchester in Wilmslow. And in my day, it's expanded a lot, I said. But now we had about 200 and something people there who were all employed by the Commissioner. The Commissioner is the head of the organisation.
Right.
I was appointed by the Queen. You get a formal letter from Her Majesty the Queen. You can't be sacked in the 5 years you have your term, and I had a 2-year extension to that.
Okay.
With complete and absolutely hugely important, you're independent.
Yeah.
And you can make rulings against the Prime Minister, against cabinet ministers, against any other organisation, and large commercial organisations too. And you divide your staff up into various teams dealing with various matters, and we went through structures. On data protection, we didn't have very strong powers. We could not impose fines. I spent 3 years arguing the toss with the government that we should have the power to impose fines. And the government finally agreed, and it came into force the day I left office.
So that was your leaving present.
My successor from day one was able to impose a fine of up to £500,000. And I argued for 3 years for that fine capacity to come in. Right. Now the fines are hugely more. Under the new GDPR, they're much, much greater. But the concept of fines we pioneered. We said we need to have teeth like other regulatory bodies. The only teeth we had were to make an order, stop doing this, or do this, and they were fairly rare because legally they were quite difficult. So the main power we had was, if you like, reputation bashing. Where we put out public statements, we criticised, We got public opinion, we got the press. We put enormous effort into getting the media to understand our role and to publicise what we did.
Yeah.
And when banks misbehaved, it became front page of the Financial Times or the Times.
Yeah.
When government lost, you may recall, the government lost a lot of data. They lost child benefit data for the entire population. I spent 3 days on every single front page of the Daily Mirror, the Sun newspaper, the Daily Mail. And we put enormous effort into getting that coverage. And, Gordon Brown was then the Prime Minister and he felt the pain. And actually that led to getting more powers for my office and not least the power to impose fines.
Fine.
When I started, Bruce, we're going back, 18 years now, 2002. Data protection was a pretty obscure, nerdy subject. There were only 2 lawyers who understood anything about it, one in London and one in my office. I didn't understand that much about it. My office it had one computer. It was called the walk-up machine for email. There was no such thing as Google. None of that existed. We saw it coming.
Yeah.
I had a fascinating experience with Facebook where we saw that coming, but we were too late. I said to my European colleagues, Facebook is coming. Oh, no, it'll never come to Europe. Well, it did come to Europe.
Yeah.
But, we saw the potential of technology and we hadn't got that many powers except to shout very loud. And you'll have gathered I quite enjoy, getting people. I gave evidence to, I think, 12 parliamentary committees in 1 year. And we made sure they were well publicised.
Yep.
We, produced about 4 or 5 reports every year. We did a lot of work before the phone hacking scandal, exposing the misbehaviour of private investigators.
Yeah.
And we prosecuted them. We had the power to take them to court because they were committing criminal offences. And when we got 50 or £100 fines, I screamed. And I did 2 very high-profile reports saying these people should go to prison if they hack into databases and steal data. And that was all before the phone hacking thing really got going.
Yeah.
So and the government agreed. They gave us the power to much stronger power. So I had about 8 or 9 ex-policemen on my staff. I had some really good people who knew how to dig deep, get answers.
Yep.
But it was not an aggressive approach. I want to repeat the leadership role. Dialogue, constructive engagement was really important. It's only when there was a complete breakdown or when someone was deliberately ignoring the law or just cavalier in their approach, that's when we tried to take the enforcement action.
So when you think about what it is you're doing in terms of that sort of education and leadership role, it's almost like it's defining that these are the expectations as enshrined in the law. My job as a regulator and my team's job is to, get you to, in effect, to help you to comply with your legal requirements. And by the way, these legal requirements, if you want to work within the market, if you want to leverage the market opportunity.
I paused there, Bruce, because one of the things I said time and time again, data protection falls under 3 broad headings: legal / paperwork, technical, and people.
Yeah.
And too often you saw organisations dump it in one place. They dumped it on their lawyers, or they dumped it on their technical people, or they dumped it on their HR people.
Right.
And that was never, ever going to work because lawyers never saw the big picture and took a too legalistic approach and were focused purely on tick boxing and compliance. Mm-hmm. The technical people, the engineers, those who knew what technology could do and how it behaved, they were great, but they were staying within their box. Mm-hmm. And the HR people, really important, were involved in training people and getting people to behave properly, whether they were frontline or behind the scenes. But none of those 3 boxes were going to do it by themselves. So organizations which got it right, fundamentally important, elevated it up to the top. I thought it was a board level, a chief executive level, a chief privacy officer level. You need to have some, it depends on the organization, obviously, but for a medium to large organization, there had to be somebody with oversight who took it seriously.
Right.
And increasingly, we saw this in terms of risk management. And most organizations in those days were very focused on risk management in other areas of life. You know, what happens if there's a fire or flood? What happens if the markets crash? So they had that. They had good risk registers, good sort of approach to predicting the likelihood of problems and the seriousness of problems. I said, well, do data protection the same way and bring those 3 strands together. Bring the lawyers together with the technical people, with the people, but dump it in one place. You've got to bring those 3 together. Otherwise, you won't get data protection right.
So the important bit there is, you've got the challenge and you go of identifying key stakeholders and getting them all working together to maximize the potential benefit within the organization. You use a phrase there, risk management, that some might interpret that as, okay, there are some risks that we're willing to take.
Yes.
In the early days when I was working in information security, data protection, but this was specifically around information security, somebody said to me, of course our employees have to do this. It's in their contracts. And the lawyer in me says, it's in their contracts, but it doesn't mean they have to do it. I said, the contract defines the need, but to remind people that this is what's expected of you. And if you don't behave this way, then this is the potential repercussions of not behaving that way. Do you think that, because I'm a believer in the risk management approach, but do you think when we say risk management, people might interpret that as, if I'm prepared to take that risk, then I'll take that risk?
That's quite a complicated question you're asking there, Bruce. But what I would say is that it's outcomes and results that matter. So, yes, you've got to document what you're doing. And yes, you need to have policies and procedures which set out what you're aspiring to and what you try to do. But if you just write those out, think how wonderful, and then put them in a drawer and no one ever looks at them, they're a complete waste of time.
Yeah.
So they should be there, but they are necessary but not sufficient. So I would be far more impressed by an organization which, by the behavior of the people, by the relationships with their customers or their employees, be far more impressed with that, even if there was an occasional mistake, even if a risk materialized which wasn't too serious. Mm-hmm. I'm generalizing a bit, but if it was sort of a fairly trivial bit of non-compliance, we would just ignore it. We were pretty good at turning a blind eye as long as we thought they were trying to get it right. So trying to get it right, aspiring to get it right, what really ticked the box for us. But it was those who had no policies, had no training, had no common sense sometimes. Often it was just a matter of sort of, reflecting on what might happen and how you're dealing with a particular piece of information.
Yes.
And you see, if a crisis happened, if somebody, suffered very grievous harm because someone was manifestly careless with their data, sometimes the police, got the wrong person or things like that. And, we took some very serious situations there. I'll give you an example. We got quite concerned about the police wanting to keep records of people until they were 100 years old. And we said that's simply the wrong approach. Think about the impact. We had examples of a 13-year-old girl in the school playground got into a fight, and rather than sort of go through all the court procedure, her mother said she'll accept a caution. Right. So on her record was a caution for a fight. When she got to 25 years old, she was disqualified from being a social worker because she had a criminal record. And I thought that was outrageous. That's an example of a policy which hadn't been thought through.
Yeah.
Another guy, his father shopped him because he'd stolen the father's car.
Right.
And then he was stopped when he became a chartered accountant from getting a green card to go to the United States because he had a criminal record. Yeah. So, a lot of common sense comes into that. But, in legal terms, proportionality and things like that. Yeah. So I would say all the time, yes, good risk management accepts that, you might be doing less than perfection. You might have some problems along the way, but it's the effort to try and get it right that's really important.
So I think that's what I'd like to talk about a little bit further than that. Sort of how do you getting the effort? How do you demonstrate the effort to try, we've got all our data protection, freedom of information, policies and processes and procedures. You mentioned there about, educating people upon that. But we know that even though people have been made aware of things, even though people have maybe been assessed, their competency assessed, and they've passed the competency test, they've got 80% or whatever the pass grade is, the time that they've got to remember the policy and then decide to apply it, there is a reasonable likelihood that people don't comply. Because the assumption is that, I know from a legal perspective, the assumption is if we tell people what to do, they will do it. But actually, in reality, life is full of lots of examples. Yeah. And most listeners will know, they go, even though I know that I was supposed to drive at 30 miles an hour on this road, I decided to drive over it. I think in West Yorkshire, there was well over 100,000 fines issued for driving in excess of the speed. So these are places where people are very clear about the rules. They're reminded on the road, for example, but they still do it. So for you as a regulator, how do you take comfort that an organization has taken the responsibility of influencing behavior rather than just writing the policy? How do you see that?
Well, one of the things I used to bang on about a lot was that we had to appeal to what I call the enlightened self-interest of organizations. When you look at the organization and the people in it, why do they exist? What are they trying to do? Well, they're trying to satisfy their customers, or they're trying to impress their voters, or they're handling members of the public as a police force, or they need to satisfy their shareholders. And what I try to time and time again is getting data protection right is in the interests of your customers, or the interests of your voters, or the interests of your shareholders, or putting it around the other way, getting it wrong is going to cause some problems. And a number of examples where share prices went down quite dramatically because people were in trouble with the regulators. There's a very good example, which I used a lot in the United States, of a big supermarket chain which used its loyalty cards to predict which of its customers were pregnant. Now, a pregnant customer is a very valuable customer, so they got very excited about this, but they didn't think about it. And their computers got it 99-point-something% right. They wrote to people saying, congratulations, we know you're pregnant. But it was a 0.3%. The lady who was not pregnant, who was unable to conceive children, got it wrong. The unmarried 16-year-old whose father was outraged on receiving this. The cases like that. And when that became public, the share price of that supermarket, seriously crashed. It had to completely rethink its approach. So I would say enlightened self-interest was a thing which I appealed to in terms of, corporate behavior. I mean, I mentioned I'd worked in law firms and I saw a lot about how organizations actually behave in practice and what risks they take. And I would say that reputation was very, very important to most organizations. They didn't want to be seen to be getting it wrong. I'm generalizing, but there was a minority who didn't care, but the vast majority wanted to get things right. So they put effort into training, put effort into getting it right, but did that because of the self-interest they were going to get out at the end of the day. Now, self-interest may simply be keeping the regulator off your back. Well, fair enough, not going to have any problems, but I think it can go further. One particular way is what I call the harms-based approach. Think through what harm might be caused if you are mishandling personal information. You could cause financial damage to individuals. You could cause reputational damage to the individual. You can cause people to lose their jobs. You can cause people to get the wrong medical care. You can, various things can go wrong. So according to the particular environment in which we're talking about, and obviously you can't generalize too much. A hospital will have a very different approach from a bank. But in each case, think what you're doing is huge, massive amounts of data being collected these days. It's a very, very valuable commodity. It's the new oil. It's a fantastic asset, but be very careful what you do with it. And if you're going to, cause these sorts of harms, then, think very carefully what's in our own self-interest. And, pissing off very large volumes of your customers because you shared their data with other people is not going to be in your own self-interest.
And I think it's there because often when we look at the opportunity that comes from having data, we see it as, we see, it's 98%. This is going to deliver us a 98% sort of move forward in some way or other. And it's the fact that the other 2%, we're not interested in that. It's like, what does it give? And it's like, but the small percentage where it takes something away from us can cause a lot more harm. And it can actually, a certain percentage of the 98% that would buy into something will turn around and go, I've heard the story and I don't want to take part in it.
I was rather pleased. I mean, this was, my amateur way trying to run the organisation on those sorts of lines. And I think that's broadly still the approach taken by the ICO. But I was quite pleased about 4 or 5 years ago to come across Professor Christopher Hodges at Oxford University, who's written this great chunky book, Law and Corporate Behaviour, 800 pages. And he has documented why organisations comply with the law. And he's got 4 or 5 chapters on psychology and then looking at lots of different sectors: aviation, care homes, food standards, financial services, health and safety in the workplace, everything under the sun. And he's done some really, really interesting thing which validates the same approach, that enlightened self-interest. People don't just comply with the law because they think they're going to get punished. Fines are only there as a last resort. But he didn't cover data protection. So Chris and I have worked together the last 2 or 3 years, and we wrote a paper together for my think tank called Regulating for Results.
Yep.
And that really brings to life some of the things that, good, effective regulation looks like in the data protection area.
Yeah.
One of the examples I'm quite fond of using with current data protection regulators is the health and safety in the workplace area.
Yeah.
And as a French academic has done a really interesting study about the British approach, which was the health and safety executive, moved away from inspections and fines on building sites and instead say we're going to put all our effort into training organizations with codes of practice, with training to get safety in the workplace. And that was about 10 years ago.
Right.
5 years ago, before the study, the German regulator copied the same approach. But the French regulator stuck with the old inspection and fines approach, just knocking on a building site once a year. If things weren't right, then they issued a fine. What's really interesting is that the study compares those three approaches over the 10-year cycle. The death rate per building site dramatically reduced in the UK. In Germany, it's gone down by half. In France, it stayed much the same. That's quite an interesting comparison as to what we mean by effective.
Yeah.
In effectiveness in the workplace is stopping people being injured and killed on a workplace.
Yeah.
In data protection, it's making sure that individuals don't suffer harm because their information has been used in irresponsible or wrong ways, or that society doesn't suffer a harm. I mean, I used to talk about sleepwalking into a surveillance society where people are scared of, sharing too much information because it emanates out and gets into the hands of the wrong people.
Yeah.
And, history has taught us in Nazi Germany, Soviet Russia, we've seen what happens when information is misused. So there are limits to all that.
Yeah.
But we have to be very focused on what is the result if it goes wrong.
I think it's interesting because when you use the word effective, and it makes me wonder, when I sit down and talk to people often and go, okay, so what is the objective? So when you measure effectiveness against an objective and make, in one breath, it could be, for example, effectiveness is it's the tick box exercise. And so you say, okay, we've done the audit, whatever. We're told we are compliant. But actually, the purpose behind the regulation with the health and safety is to reduce the number of deaths or the number of injury as well. It's not just death, is it? So actually, it's like you can have as many boxes ticked as you want.
Yeah.
Any audits done as well. But actually, the benefit to the society is about actually changing behaviours and reducing the number of deaths.
Totally. And I think that's going back to some of our earlier points we were discussing, Bruce. I mean, for an organisation, getting it right is not just complying with the law. And from a regulator's point of view, it's not effective to say, well, people have ticked all the boxes. Effectiveness means actually delivering a better society where behaviours are in line with expectations. That's why I've got some reservations about the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation in Europe, which is now part of UK law, because that's very detailed and very prescriptive. Do this, do this, do this, do this, don't do that, don't do that, don't do that. But there's not very much clarity as to what you're trying to achieve. You have to read between the lines to actually understand what effectiveness looks like. So I would favour, in my ideal world, shorter, more generalised laws which spell out what we're trying to achieve and then leave a fair amount. I mean, you've got so many different types of organisation. You've got mega corporations to tiny, 1-2 person organisations. Yeah. And you've got to adjust your expectations according to each. And that's why I do support the risk-based approach, go back to that, because I think if you can say what the objectives are, what the harms are, then you can rely far more on organisations, saying to themselves, well, what sort of data are we processing? What sort of processing are we adopting?
Yep.
What type of organisation are we? What sort of people are we dealing with? And then you can say, how likely will these risks materialise and how serious would they be if they did materialise? So that's the approach. If I ruled the world, that's how I would do it rather more clearly, I think.
So on the matter of clarity, in legislation like GDPR, but there's a prevailing phrase that I see where we use the phrase education and awareness. It's like, so you've done your policy work. Okay. Now you've got to educate all those stakeholders that it's relevant to. So you talk about education and awareness. And I wonder, whether or not, because that's not just in GDPR. I mean, a lot of the standards, ISO 27001, NIST, etc., they were all, this phrase is being used across all these different drivers for change across society. Education awareness, from a clarity perspective, what does it mean?
You're right. I mean, it's a phrase which trips off the tongue, and bringing that to life can be really quite a challenge. I said earlier that, data protection divides into legal, technical, and people. Well, people is education and awareness, and somehow, I'm not diminishing the role of law or technology. You've got to somehow find ways, according to the scale and the size of the organization, to bring it to life in ways that people can understand. I mean, one of the golden rules of plain English is write for your audience.
Yep.
And lots of government forms, can't be read or understood properly by, people who are familiar with the Times or the Financial Times. You need to bring it down to tabloid level.
Yep.
We put a lot of weight on regular training courses, and, well-run organizations did train their staff and did, not in every minutiae of GDPR, for goodness sake, no, of course not. But in terms of common sense approach to understanding the sensitivities around different sorts of data, understanding, what could happen if things went wrong. And, I think probably when GDPR came in and before that time, there were endless internal and external training courses, and some were absolutely excellent, some were more questionable. And you have to keep on plugging away. It's like anything else. You need to have people who've got responsibility. You need to have somebody, probably at board or near board level, who is accountable for getting it right inside the organization.
Yeah.
And they've got to push all the right buttons, to make sure there is education awareness. And I would say you can't overload people. You really can't expect them to have every last detail. Of course not. But, making them just aware of often just the sensitivity. I mean, in a hospital environment, care over what's happened with patient records, who they're sent to and how well they are kept up to date and how accurate they are. It's important. And that what we did there was to plug into, if you like, the medical traditions of confidentiality. It's always been a very strong principle in the medical world that you keep patient records confidential. So we plugged into that and kept alive with that. In the banking world, obviously banks want to have up-to-date information about their customers' records, but when they went down the slippery slope, for example, of using that information to misleadingly sell PPI, personal insurance for payment protection insurance, when there's a massive scandal, they were using the data rather irresponsibly there. And they were bitten hard by that. They got 40, 50 billion pounds of compensation they had to pay. So you work with the marketplace. A lot of the attention we focused on the public sector, because the public sector is not subject to the same competitive pressures as the private sector is. So we did a lot with central government, local government, public bodies of one sort or another, the police I've mentioned. It's quite hard to generate. You've got to break it down into the different sort of markets you're dealing with. And the way you asked me earlier, how was the ICO organized? Well, we had, sectoral teams. We had a sort of, banking, financial services team. We had a retail team. We had a local government team, central government team, and they understood far more, about the needs and the problems and the aspirations inside their sector.
Yeah, I think it's that point about education and awareness. When we use the phrase, and sometimes I wonder whether or not when you use the phrase like education and awareness, whether it's done with the right intention, which is that we want to actually bring around but changes in behaviour. And I've seen quite a few comments made by regulators, not just UK, but more worldwide, where when something goes wrong or where they're talking to industry from an educational perspective, leadership perspective, they talk about culture as well. So actually, often what you see is that, well, actually, the objective for us to bring around the benefits of data protection, we have to change behaviour. So when you use the phrase education and awareness, okay, and people take a tick box exercise and they go, we've done the education, done the awareness, but the behaviour isn't part of that. We know it's an outcome we want, but it's not part of the legislation. It's not another box to tick off. And I think it's interesting because then I've looked at something from the Financial Services Ombudsman, the FCA, and as part of the educational work that they were doing at conferences, they're talking about the importance of being able to demonstrate a data protection information sort of security culture. And by that, what they were talking about was actually governance, risk and compliance. And for me, I just wonder whether or not the people that put the legislation together, which they then ask the regulator to enforce, if they continue to use the word education and awareness, then that sets the benchmark for a lot of people to focus on, instead of, well, actually, for the legislation to bring around the benefits to society that we envisaged, it's really about behaviour and culture that we ought to be looking for.
Yes, I mean, I don't disagree with that, but I think that you've got to sort of somehow bring it all together to bring it to life. I mean, you need the legislation to set out the expectations. You need understanding of that. You need to have people who ensure that the technology is compliant with those things. I wouldn't dismiss that phrase education awareness. You need, people to put a lot of effort into making sure people understand it. So to give an example, going back to what you're saying about financial services, I mean, how do you collect information? Well, it's either online or through forms which people fill in. You need someone to seriously sit down and make sure that the way in which they're collecting information online or through paperwork forms is meeting the requirements of the law, not asking, for example, for too much information or, so that for an organization, the systems, whether they're electronic or manual, the systems have to be compliant, and you need to have, a small team making sure, one person or a small team doing that. But that's not enough by itself. You've got to have then the people who are receiving the information, making sure they do the right things with it. So they need the training and the awareness to do that. So a bank may have perfectly good forms which collect, age, sex, financial history, all that sort of information. If that is then carelessly just sprayed around and handed on to other organizations or shared with government or shared with the police, that would be inappropriate. So you've got to make sure the people on the ground do have the education and the understanding of taking care with that.
Yeah. In your white paper, I remember reading you're focused upon this outcome-focused approach to data protection. And, if you think of the outcome is to make data protection values just part of what it is to be a member of society, whether that's an organization, a member of society, or as an individual, then should part of that process is about saying, okay, look, we've done the education and awareness piece, but actually we want to bring around behavior. So how it's constantly improving things, isn't it? And pushing.
Yeah, but again, it's back to my line about keeping it simple. Data protection now looks horribly complicated and legalistic, but at its heart, there's about half a dozen really clear messages. Yep. Don't collect more than you need. Only collect it for a clear purpose which you understand. Keep it secure. Make sure it's accurate. Don't share it with inappropriate recipients. Now, those can be tailored inside an organization pretty easily. And those are core messages. But if you just chuck the whole of the, GDPR or the Act of Parliament to people and say, well, there's your education awareness, it's a complete waste of time.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that I really liked about GDPR, how things have moved along for me, is that simple language.
Well, I disagree with that. I think the language of GDPR is horrendous. Some of it is, I've got it on the other side of the room, but it's that thick. And some of the language I think is far too obscure. But one of the good things about GDPR was the high level of fines. And it can be multi-million pound fines now. And that scared people. You don't want to impose fines, too lightly or too regularly or too frequently, because fines are almost a recognition of failure on the part of the regulator. But one hugely beneficial thing is it really raises awareness at the board level, at the senior management level, the middle management level, at the shop floor level. Everyone knows now, my God, mega fines are in prospect. So that was hugely important. In the last 2 or 3 years, hugely important in raising awareness and making people think about data protection.
I think the issue of fines is really an interesting one because people know the new under detection, we could be fined. I think the difference is that people say, will it actually happen? So to actually see something happening, and it's actually from a behavioral perspective, it's called salience. And you're like, okay, so it's in their mind. But it's amazing how quickly we forget as humans because we fill it with other stuff. But to go back to the GDPR point I made, I wasn't really talking about the actual legislation because the legislation is, as legislation often is, it's pretty complex. For me, it's how the data protection community is now talking about data protection in those simple terms that you were talking about. And then for me, when I hear those terms, I think these are just principles by which to do your job.
Yep.
Giving those people the principles and make sure the principles actually wrap around the detail of the legislation so they can deliver against it. That, for me, is the sort of, by just simplifying it that way and coming up with a design, almost what I call design principles, it's how you then design, 1, the technology, 2, the processes, and 3, how you go around trying to influence behaviour.
Yeah, I agree with all that. Just a warning and an example. Yesterday, I was taking part in a round table with quite a lot of senior data people and civil servants about the UK's national data strategy, and I was quite, not horrified, but one person piped up and said, "Well, I'm doing nothing but data protection inside my organisation, and I spend 80% of my time drafting documents."
Yeah.
And only 20% of trying to bring it to life.
Yep.
And it should be the other way around. Now, hopefully that's a temporary thing whilst, the new regime settles down, but that's pretty shocking. I would much rather 20% on drafting documents and 80% on being the evangelist and making people more aware and getting people to think, to a large extent, what I call in common sense terms, just be aware of, what could go wrong.
Yeah. I know with my own experience around information security in particular, often we invest time in engaging once we develop the security product, the policy, or it could be data protection policy. And it's actually the design of the product, how you develop the policy in itself, the process you go through is one of the best ways with which you can influence behavioral outcomes. So, you talk about using, almost like a policy, a writing policy, which is keep it simple.
Yeah. Well, I just, keep it simple and just use common sense. I mentioned earlier the government had a huge embarrassment when the entire child benefit database was lost. And that was lost because a mid-ranking civil servant put that database onto 2 CD discs and posted them to the National Audit Office. They were being audited.
Right.
Those discs were sent in the ordinary post without any encryption, without any sort of safeguarding whatsoever. And they got lost. And that had enormous political damage for the government at the time.
Yeah.
Now, that was just someone stupid, not thinking that here was this, database of people's parents, child benefit, bank records, bank details, just being put in the post on 2 discs. Yeah. And that was a wake-up call. And a lot of politicians also said to me, "Oh, I didn't even know you can get that much data on a disc." And
yeah,
I didn't really think that sort of data needed to be protected. Well, I think there has been a sea change since then. People are far more security aware, but there's still, careless and stupid mishaps which happen.
Yeah.
And, you've now got it far worse because you've got the criminal element, which are, deliberately seeking to hack in. So you've got to have all the time one step ahead to try and keep the deliberate hackers out of your systems.
Yeah. Okay, so I guess on the final point, we come back to that corporate behaviour phrase that you use and Chris Hodges' work that you're talking about there. Is there a difference between corporate behaviour and employee behaviour from a regulatory perspective?
No, I don't think so. I would say, without thinking too deeply about it, that, the organisation is the sum total of its people. And the people are there because they work for the organisation. And I think you can tell quite a lot about the culture and the style of an organisation by some fairly basic detective work. If you look at their website, you look at their paperwork, you look at the way in which they correspond, you can tell quite a lot. As I say, you'll get some organisations which are just cavalier or couldn't give a toss about these matters. Well, you tend to target those. You have to set priorities as a regulator. You can't do everything. You can't expect everyone to follow the speed limit all the time, to use your analogy. Yeah. So you set priorities. And part of that is, if you like, organisations which initially have a smell about what they're doing. You're normally driven by intelligence and by complaints. So you ticked off or you have some sort of reason to doubt what's going on. One of my cases in my last year there was the secret database in the construction industry. We discovered there was a database of troublemakers in the construction industry. Yep. Trade union activists, or one case, Irish, things like this. Yep. And it was a pretty big clue that there was zero publicity about this database. and it was hidden away in a backstreet office in the Midlands somewhere.
Right.
And, it was run by half a dozen people. It was collecting information amidst great secrecy, on the part of major construction companies. Well, there was a smell there, and we weren't getting any sort of feedback from the organisation, either its staff or the organisation. So we got a warrant, and we had a search warrant and went into these premises, and sure enough discovered what we suspected.
Yeah.
Now, that's how you have to work as a regulator. They knew what they were doing was wrong.
Yeah.
Pretty obvious that they were doing it in breach of both data protection law and decent behaviour, and they were secretive about it. Well, that sets up the alarm signal straight away. I'll give you another example which goes the other way. A major supermarket came to us and said, we've been asked by the police to share some details of our customer loyalty database. A man is suspected of killing his wife, and they want to look at his record of buying stuff at the supermarket. And sure enough, it was revealed, because the supermarket knew this, he had not only purchased the knife with his card at the supermarket, he'd got the loyalty points on it.
Right, okay.
So that was pretty strong evidence to convict a man of murder. So that was a very cautious supermarket, and I give them full marks for being cautious and treating their very sensitive and valuable customer information very carefully, to the extent they wouldn't share it with the police unless we said it was okay.
Yeah, and that's a reflection of the culture within the organisation. And do you think there's a difference sometimes between the culture at the top and the culture throughout the rest of the organisation? This is what we say we do, but this is actually what happens sometimes at a ground level.
Well, I can certainly think of examples where that happens, yes. But, I've been involved in a wide range of organisations, and I think by and large the tone is set from the top. And so if it gradually filters down, not happen overnight, but, my experience is that middle and junior staff follow example rather than bits of paper. So if they see the senior people are taking these things seriously, if they see people behaving in responsible ways, then they will do it themselves. I'm generalising again, but, if they see a sort of a careless, cavalier, deliberate approach, then I think it doesn't matter very much. So there'll be exceptions to that. But as a broad principle, I would say that, the tone is set from the top.
And I think, from a sort of behavioural psychology perspective, rings true of the actual science. The science is that when it comes to making decisions, we're heavily influenced by our peers, the people we work within, and those people that we might look up to, like our line managers, etc. So when you talk about that as principle, it's interesting because from a behavioral psychology perspective, it's like that is something which is common across all humanity. It doesn't matter which part of the world you're from, what type of organization, big corporate, small business. We are often actually subconsciously influenced by just what we see going on around us. And that's the importance of the top down, because it taps into that. But also, I guess when we're influenced by our colleagues who could be on the same level of us or, junior to us, I guess it highlights the culture. It does come from the top down, but it's also what we see going on around us day to day as well.
I agree with that and totally agree with that. But equally, seeing how your colleagues are being either rewarded or admonished for what they're doing, so what comes, and most organizations are hierarchical up to quite a large extent. And if your colleagues are being allowed to get away with murder, well, you may follow that. Equally, if your colleagues are being sort of told, hang on a minute, that's not quite right, that's how you do it in future, then you'll take your cue from that. So you can't divorce the two, really.
No. Okay. Right.
Fascinating conversation, Bruce. I wish a bit more psychology would, get into the minds of the European Commission and some of the regulators around Europe and even in this country. But I think, it's hugely important territory. I've only really come across since I left office, and I was doing it by sort of, common sense, really. But I think there's a lot more written about it. But psychology's got a lot to play in all this, and culture and behaviour and practice is hugely important.
Yeah, it's interesting talking to you. For me, one of the things I think really like to see happening in 2021 is that conversation around the role of behaviour and culture in terms of achieving the actual benefits to society that regulators are looking to do and the laws are there for. I think it's a conversation to be had. I know it's already going on, but for me, around information security, data protection, it's something I'm like, part of what I want to do is to raise.
It's a long journey. There's still a long way to go.
It's a long journey. I know. But I've got good walking boots. So I'm rather hoping that I'll be there to see it come in. Maybe a bit like yourself, where, you suddenly saw the fines after all the hard work in terms of the requirement, your wish to have fines in place. The day you leave is the day the fines actually suddenly arrived.
C'est la vie.
C'est la vie. Okay, Richard, it's been great having you here and sharing your thoughts. I think the listeners will be quite a lot away from there. And I think it's really important for them they understand from an ex-regulator's perspective and understand the regulator's general view on things as well, where they're coming from, to help them really think about how they ought to be reconsidering the human factor when it comes to data protection and security. So thank you very much for joining us.
Okay, all the best.
All right.
So I'm hoping you found that conversation with Richard really interesting. I know that when Richard agreed to come on the show, I was totally chuffed. One, because he has such a huge amount of experience. Two, because he is highly respected within the privacy data protection community on a global level. I think the third point is that it's really interesting when you look at his work, the reports that he writes in his sort of new capacity, post being the regulator in the United Kingdom for data protection, how he started picking up upon that whole human factor aspect. And when I was introduced to Richard, I think that was one of the things that sort of gelled us very quickly, was this sort of like, I was thinking very much around that whole challenge of awareness, behavior, culture, how if you do that better, you're basically driving not just privacy within the context of an organization, but privacy on a social level that contributes to society, which is something which is really, really keen upon. But also we kept coming back to that whole, behavior is what it's all about. And you can write as many regulations, as many standards as you want. But if you're going to deliver the benefits that were envisioned behind these things, you've got to be able to change behaviors. And I think that's why Richard and I seem to sort of connect. So great to have him on the show. Great for me to kick the ball out there to the regulators and say, look, this is something that we need to be talking about. And that's something over the next year or so that you're going to hear more from us about. If you're interested in how can we engage more with regulators to raise the sort of challenge around the human factor with them, please do get in contact with me at bruce.hallis@re-thinkingthehumanfactor.com. Right. So if you find what I've been talking about today, but also in other episodes, interesting, how can you find more? How can you access the research that we're doing, which I guess we're sort of illustrating through all these interviews that we're doing with our guests? Well, there's a number of ways you can do that, but the best way for you to do that is to visit www.re-thinkingthehumanfactor.com/webinar. That's right. Come and register for our webinar where I'll be there. We're talking about how we help people like yourselves, CISOs, education and awareness managers, security data protection professionals, reassess what the actual human factor is, and then use that new vision to come up with strategies which leverage a really true understanding of what it means to be human to drive more effective campaigns, initiatives, programs to bring around changing awareness, behavior and culture. And so finally, it'd be great to have you join us for our next episode, which is promising to be very interesting for those of you who are interested in the human factor.